This is Truth Be Told.
That not only are there reptilians here,
new evidence of UFO fleets.
We were close to nuclear war.
To help you transform so that you can live your highest truth.
We're not being told just because we're not ready for it.
Radio stations of frequency, vibrational.
I was a homicide detective with LAPD.
UFOs increase. Visitations.
This is Truth Be Told.
that not only are there reptilians here.
Today we dive into the world of the mob, the Mafia. We have Matthew Birkbeck talking about his new book, The Life We Choose, about the American Mafia and the life of William Big Billy Delia. We're going to dive into this organized crime family and see what really went on. Are there misconceptions? What's the bright side? What's the downside on the Bufalino family? Big Billy was the right-hand man of the legendary Mafia kingpin Russell Bufalino, who ran the organized crime in the United States for more than 50 years. Well, get ready for a ride of your life. I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told studios for the first time, author, investigative journalist, and executive producer of Netflix #1 movie Girl in the Picture, Matt Birkbeck. Hello, Matt. How you doing?
Hey, Tony. How you doing?
I'm good. Do you go by Matt or Matthew or both?
Matt's fine.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to talk about the book, The Life We Choose, and I found it fascinating that you chose The Life We Choose because I always thought sometimes in the Mafia family that you're kind of born into it than choosing to be into it. But before we answer that question, first of all, how did you get started, or how did you get interested in writing this book?
So Billy actually found me.
Oh.
I had received an email in August of 2020, just out of the blue, and the email said, would I be interested in talking to Bill? And I had covered him when I was a newspaper reporter many years ago in the early 2000s. He had been arrested in 2006, and I knew who he was. I knew how important he was. I also knew that he had never spoken before to anyone, not to law enforcement, not to journalists. And what makes Bill unique is that he headed the Bufalino crime family from 1994 on, which is based in northeastern Pennsylvania. But he had been the protege and the so-called son of Russell Bufalino, who is arguably the most powerful and influential organized crime figure of the 20th century. And FBI, Secret Service, Homeland Security, New York City Terrorism Task Force, dozens of agencies wanted to talk to Bill when he had been arrested in 2006, because they figured he knew a lot, particularly about things like Jimmy Hoffa.
Right. What
happened to him, given that Russell Bufalino had been a chief suspect in Hoffa's disappearance. So when I saw the email, I just, I figured I knew how to talk to him. So we met a couple weeks later, and then we ended up speaking for almost 2 years.
So, I mean, building that trust, I'm sure with somebody of his stature, how do you build a trust with someone like that to, let him open up to you, to giving so much information about usually a society that's pretty quiet?
Yeah, very, very slowly. It took. I mean, Bill he's in his mid-70s now, and he wanted to set the record straight on a couple of things, one of which was the 2019 film The Irishman, which was about Jimmy Hoffa and Frank Sheeran, and Joe Pesci played Bufalino in that one, and it's about Frank Sheeran claiming to have killed Jimmy Hoffa, and Billy said it was fiction. And he wanted to straighten the record on that. And he also wanted to, and also he didn't like how Russell Bufalino had been portrayed, in that he seemed to be more of an underling to other mob figures, when in fact he was the boss of I know they've used this term before, but I asked Bill once, was Russell ever a member of the Mafia Commission, the 5-member commission that basically ruled over organized crime? He says, no, he wasn't a member of the commission. He was above the commission. That did not, that was not portrayed in the film. So Bill wanted to set the record straight on that and a couple of other things. And it took, I mean, it was hard for me, but it must have been even hard for him because he never spoke to anyone before. And so it took us about 4 or 5 months before he started to really trust me and started to share.
So now, Delia, is that Italian? That doesn't sound Italian to me, but or is that Irish?
No, William Delia. So,
or Delia, I'm sorry.
Yeah, his father's Italian. His mother is Irish.
Okay.
But he wasn't born into organized crime. He wasn't born into the mob. This was something that, the book is called The Life We Chose, and he made a conscious choice to join it.
How did he get introduced to the crime family? Was it just friends in the neighborhood, or how did that happen?
So he lived in northeastern Pennsylvania in a town called Pittston, which was very Italian and still is to this day. And it was the home base for Russell Buffalino. So Russell spent half his time in Pennsylvania, but he also spent the other half of his time in New York City. But Russell controlled everything from coast to coast. He was that powerful. And, people know people. They have neighbors and they all know him. And he bumped into Buffalino a couple of times, including his sister's wedding. His sister married the son of the underboss of the Buffalino family. Oh, wow. And Russell was at that wedding. But what really cemented it was when Billy was working in an appliance store. He was a student at the time. He was going to business school, and he was in the Army Reserves, but he was also working in an appliance store, and he was installing the old 8-track tapes into cars. And he did he was asked to do one for Buffalino, and he did it. And then he was asked to drive the car to bring it back to Buffalino. And he did that. He brought it to him at a luncheonette. They started talking. Buffalino says, "You want to come back tomorrow?" And Bill said, "Sure." And that was it. They were together for almost 30 years.
Well, I wouldn't know, but being somebody that loves movies and television and all kinds of different types of genres of TV and films, watching a lot of gangs, and I don't necessarily call the crime family a gang, but it's more of maybe an upper class of a gang society. But a lot of times they were beat, like these street gangs, you had to be beaten to get into the gang. What was his initiation, or was there an initiation to get into this family?
There wasn't really an initiation. It was really about
loyalty and
trust and loyalty. Yeah. When you read the book, you see the book is really, despite the organized crime background and the many people that we see in the book, not just members of the mob, but leaders in business, entertainment, sports. There's a million names in the book. Billy has to earn Russell's trust, and it takes several years. There's a scene in the book where it's Thanksgiving and Billy's newly married. He had been with Russell for a few years, and he comes back from New York on Thanksgiving Day, and there's a phone call, and Russell says, "I forgot my shaver. I need you to bring it back." And Billy brings it back. He goes all the way back to New York City, brings the razor, and Russell says, "See, I told you the kid would come." And that's what it was about. So they became very, very close. Their families became very close. And to this day, Billy's affection towards Russell is kind of something to marvel at.
Now, Russell, did he have any children?
He did not, which makes this story even more interesting in that Bill became his so-called adopted son. Russell started introducing him as his son after they were together for roughly a year or so. This is my boy Bill, and then this is my son Bill. And so that opened doors for Bill immediately. When you were visiting other mob leaders, other business tycoons and whatnot, and Russell Buffalino introduces you, to Jimmy Hoffa, for instance. There's a scene where he introduces Bill to Jimmy Hoffa in Florida, and he goes, "This is my boy Bill." That just opened doors.
Well, speaking of Jimmy Hoffa, did Bill ever disclose where maybe the body's at?
So what Billy does is he clarifies who was behind Hoffa's murder. And he tells us, he meets Hoffa in 1972 in Florida after Hoffa got out of prison. And then he meets him again at a party, an event in New Jersey. It was Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night. Frank Sheeran was the fellow who, the Irishman, Robert De Niro portrayed in the film The Irishman. And then in the following summer in 1975, Bill tells a story of how Russell tells him, you have to take me to New York. And then on the way in there, Russell tells him that we're going to a meeting. And there are two Teamsters and members of the Genovese family there, Tony Provenzano and Tony Salerno. And the meeting, and Frank Sheeran's going to be there too. And the meeting is being held because the Provenzano and Salerno ordered Hoffa's murder, and they believed that Sheeran was going to kill them, and Sheeran would have killed them. Only the meeting was held for Sheeran to assure them that he wouldn't harm them. What Bill didn't realize at the time, and we had talked about this, and this is in the book, they wouldn't have taken that action against Jimmy Hoffa if not without the approval of Buffalino. So these were Buffalino and Provenzano and Salerno had all been early suspects. The FBI had already looked at them and believed that they had already been involved, and Billy confirms it. What we don't know is who pulled the trigger. I did ask Bill what happened to Hoffa's body afterwards, and his word was he was cooked, which meant he was cremated almost immediately within 10 minutes after he died.
The movie Hoffa, which I loved, it was Jack Nicholson. Did he ever say, like they said, The Irishman was kind of fiction? So was there a movie that was very true to their liking? Did he ever mention?
Not about Hoffa, but about organized crime in general. He said Goodfellas. We talked about this.
Yeah.
Bill was there in the early 70s when the making of The Godfather.
Right.
And how, and he tells the story of how he was in Pennsylvania with Russell at one of Russell's dress factories, and there was a phone call, and Bill picks it up, and the voice on the other end says it's Marlon Brando calling for Russell Buffalino.
Oh, wow.
And Bill turns to Russell and goes, no, he thought it was a fake call. He goes, there's some guy on the phone says he's Marlon Brando. And Russell goes, give me that phone. It was Marlon Brando. So Marlon Brando had sought out someone, preferably a mob leader, to help him prepare for the role of playing Don Corleone. And so he ended up spending a lot of time with Russell. And basically, Russell was a huge influence on the film in terms of people that were in the movie. And Russell was also a huge influence before the movie was made.
Right.
Bill describes, Russell had huge influence over the Teamsters Union. And how the Teamsters would do their thing in Lower Manhattan. There would be strikes, there'd be missing equipment, there'd be all kinds of turbulence and whatnot. And once that was settled, and then Russell basically became comfortable with it, then the movie went forward.
One of I own not only Truth Be Told, but I own a podcast studio, and Dee Dee Servino, Paul Servino's wife, has a podcast with me, and so Paul was, of course, in Goodfellas, and so they've talked about that movie several times, and unfortunately we've lost Paul, but that was a great movie. I'll have to say it. I think one of the best ones Hollywood have made. So. So it got the AOK from the former boss of a crime. Right.
So it has to be good.
Yeah. You didn't get any. If you don't get backlash from the actual who the story's about, you're pretty safe. So building that loyalty, was there something that you, and this was actually one of the questions from a fan or somebody in the chat room was asking, that what was something that you learned that was really interesting that you didn't know, that maybe even surprised you when interviewing Big Billy writing this book? Was there something that really just surprised you, or have you been in this long enough to nothing surprises you?
What surprised me was the level and the depth of the people that he knew and met and did business with. over the course of years. I knew Russell was important. I knew Russell. Russell had casinos in Cuba. He had, he had gone head to head with Bobby Kennedy in the late 50s during the racket hearings. I told you about The Godfather and Jimmy Hoffa. But Bill, when Russell goes to prison in the early 80s for a second time, Bill basically takes over the family.
Right.
And now he takes Russell's role as the mob's negotiator. And so what that meant is that it wasn't just when there were issues with organized crime. It's when there were issues with politics, sports figures, entertainment. The one story that blew me away. So Billy knew Donald Trump, and he knew him well. And there were 4 or 5 instances of them doing business together in the book, and one of which led to Billy becoming Michael Jackson's manager in 1988.
Wow.
So basically Trump wanted Jackson to perform in Atlantic City at one of his casinos, only Jackson's manager prohibited him from playing at a casino. So Trump, who had his own longstanding ties, we'll say loose ties to members of the mob, went around, it didn't end around, and enlist 2 mob heavyweights from California to convince, so to speak, the manager to change his mind. And Trump offers the mob guys $1 million. And so the manager, whose name is Frank DeLeo, who happened to also have been in Goodfellas, he played Paul Sorvino's brother. So he reaches to friends in Pittsburgh, and those Pittsburgh friends reach out to Bill. And there's this meeting in New York, and when these mob guys from LA show up and they see Bill there, they recognize him, they know who he is, and they knew that it's over. It's not going to happen. And they offered him half the Trump money. Bill says absolutely not. He's not playing a casino. They leave dejected. Frank DeLeo is thrilled. Only Bill turns to him, it's not over yet. I'm now your partner. And he then became Michael Jackson's co-manager. And he also toured with him that year. This was the year when he was on the Bad Tour. And so Bill accompanied him at different venues throughout the country, spent time with him out in California. We get deep into this in the book. So that really, and then there were a couple of other examples of doing business with Trump in the 1990s. And I mean, that kind of blew me away. Just the idea that someone like a Bill DeLeo, who's the head of a crime family,
right,
is actually meeting face to face with folks like Donald Trump. So that kind of
Michael Jackson too. That's surprising.
Yeah. And right, Michael Jackson and a ton of other people, the former owner of the Philadelphia Eagles, people who either needed a negotiation completed, they need to do some business, or in the case of the old Eagles owner, he was just a serious gambling addict and he just always needed money. So, but Bill was there. Bill filled this area, this really, there's a lot of gray in the world. I've been saying this for the past 2 weeks. One thing I learned doing this book is a ton of gray. I always thought the world was black and white and a little gray. There's a lot of gray.
More gray, yeah.
And it's populated with people like Billy DeLeo.
That actually is very fascinating, and I'm curious because most everyday people, they wake up, they get ready, they go to work, they come home, they may go to the gym, they fix their dinner, or if people even sit together anymore, watch a little TV, go to bed, and do it all over again. But we don't really think about everything that's going on in, like you said, in politics behind the scenes, and how intertwined they are. And how do you feel? And that's another question: is how do you feel how the mob lifestyle has built itself into politics and running, entertainment companies now? Because they've gotten smarter than not just in the street corners in a certain area of a city. They've gotten very high tech. They've grown into corporations. And so even, what's that new one, which I actually love, with Sylvester Stallone, the one where he goes, Tulsa. I love it. I love it. But how has it changed? The Mafia changed, since he started to now.
So the mob today is far different from what it was, say, prior to 1990. where they had immense power. I gave you some examples with Russell Buffalino. Russell was a huge influence with the Teamsters Union. He wasn't just friends with Jimmy Hoffa. He had placed his cousin William there in the 1940s with Hoffa, and William became the general counsel of the Teamsters. And that gave Russell extraordinary access, not just to the union, but to its Central States pension fund. So he wasn't just funding casinos in Las Vegas and other buildings in other parts of the country. He was influencing strikes, strike actions, and whatnot. So that kind of power in a mob control, let's say, like even with Trump, we were talking about.
Right.
In order to build a skyscraper in New York, you need to get your way around the concrete union, which was controlled by the mob. And, that was something that's been written about a number of times involving Trump and, his ability to get things done. So, but that kind of power and that kind of influence has waned to a great degree with organized crime. The government really went after them in the late 80s, early 90s, and put many of the mob chiefs away. Even Russell. Russell spent most of his last years in prison and then died in 1994.
Oh, wow.
So today it's not as prevalent as it was. It's still there, don't get me wrong, and there's still a need for people like a Bill D'Elia, but it's not anywhere near what it was, going into the 1990s.
My grandfather, my mom's dad, was a bricklayer teamster in Ventura, and so. Yeah, apparently he was kind of up there. Of course, I was a kid when he was, in it and already retired once. I don't know if you actually ever retire when it comes to when you're a part of a Teamster union. But yeah, I knew his stature, the way he presented himself. He was bohemian, so. Czech, and so they had a really strong presence. He came from Chicago, the streets of Chicago, and I'm sure that's probably where he met some of the Teamsters there. So yeah, it's interesting to hear the backstories. Unfortunately, I didn't get to sit down and talk to him about all that, but it would have been great to hear some stories. Well, what was one of your favorite parts of the book that you put on paper and you felt was pretty compelling with who Big Billy was and how you wanted to relate this to the readers?
I'm not sure if there was a favorite part of the book. I think the entire book takes you, basically it's structured in which Billy in the beginning is an observer. He's the fly on the wall with Russell.
Right.
And when Russell goes to prison in the late 70s, he relies on Bill to run the family for him. And that's when Bill becomes a power. So, it's this metamorphosis of watching someone who, again, wasn't born into this and who chose this life and chose to be with this, to be with this leader. Bill didn't have a good relationship with his own father. And there's a scene in the early part of the book which explains why, and it's kind of brutal. But it kind of sets the stage for the rest of the book. It's not an explainer. There are a lot of folks out there with, bad parents.
Right.
But it does kind of give a bit of a reason why he was so drawn to Russell. But I think it's just the metamorphosis of Bill and watching him grow. It's a father and son story at its core. It's a very intimate look at two men who live in this very misunderstood and violent world. The mob isn't all... People think about the mob and they think about, shootings and blood and murder and whatnot.
Right.
It's 99% business. That's what it's all about. It's about business. And the violence comes either when someone gets out of hand or someone does something that they shouldn't be doing. It wasn't, in the case of Russell Buffalino, even though the government described him as being one of the most powerful and violent members of organized crime, back in the early 60s, they described him as that. Russell wasn't violent by nature. He was violent when he had to be. And he could be pretty violent, don't get me wrong. But the thing that really surprised me in doing the book was just how much this life was about doing business.
Now, when Big Billy took over, did he talk about how he felt when, because that's a big undertaking to replace Russell as the leader. Did he talk about his role, and did he have any, negative feedback of thinking that he wasn't ready, or did everybody just fall in line?
Yeah, they fell in line because by that point in time, in 1994, Bill had been the de facto head of the family for more than 10 years. Mm-hmm. Russell went back to prison in early 1980s, 81, 82. He had been convicted. This all emanated from Jimmy Hoffa investigation. Since they couldn't get all these guys on Hoffa, they got them on something else.
Oh.
And in Russell's case, they got him for threatening somebody on tape. And it was pretty much a setup. But Russell went to prison, gets out, was arrested again because now he wants to kill the guy that he had threatened before. And, there's scenes in the book where the mob recruits, Billy recruits Muhammad Ali and his trainer Angelo Dundee to go to Washington to go meet with Senator Kennedy, to plead for a pardon for Russell. Only when Kennedy finds out that they're there on behalf of Buffalino, he throws them out. And that's because of Kennedy and the Kennedys and their relationship with the mob, particularly in the 1960s with his brothers. They enlist, Billy hires Roy Cohn, who I mentioned before, who was Trump's attorney. He was a big-time attorney. And those scenes are just hilarious, him and Roy Cohn in the book. So just seeing Billy go through this and all the different people that he's meeting and, watching him rise and become the power, not nearly as the power as Russell was, but become a power in his own right. To me, that was fascinating to watch and to listen to.
Well, you said he's still alive, and what is his influence now? I know what it was, and I knew, is it still as influential as it was when he took over? No, he went to prison. He was arrested for the first time ever in 2006. There were 2 raids on his homes, and there were like 20 law enforcement agencies there and a military helicopter flying overhead. Oh, wow.
He was arrested. And he went to prison. He ended up going to prison for 4 years. He got out in 2012, and he's been very low key since then. He's, let's say, retired, so to speak.
Is that the quotes?
Yes, the quotes. He lives as far as I know, he lives a very quiet life with his wife, and spends his summers. He has a summer home and off of near a river, and he spends his time there. So this is all in the past for him. And, I did say to him, though, I said, you miss it? And he did. And I said, would you change a thing? And he said, no. And, do you have any regrets? And he said, absolutely not. I mean, he spent a lot of time in the 4 years he spent in prison. It was pretty brutal. He spent some time in solitary. He dealt with a number of different things, and he doesn't regret a thing. He just thanks Russell Buffalino for introducing him to a life and, and making it, giving him a life that allowed him to meet so many different people. To him, he wouldn't change a thing.
Now, going to prison, that's one thing, but going to prison where there's potentially threats from other mafia families, do the crime families and mafia families still have the battles over territory, or is that pretty much organized now where they kind of know who's who and what's what, and then once in prison, how are they protected from other?
He was actually protected in prison when he arrived. He went to a couple of prisons, and he ended up in Arizona. And he became best friends with a couple of bikers.
Oh, that's probably smart.
One was leader of a group called the Mongols. But the prison knew who he was. The prison prepared for him before he even arrived. And so Bill became someone, actually, this is in the book. He had gone to prison in part, at least Billy claims, in that it was because there's someone else who's in the book, a very well-connected billionaire, who wanted a casino when casino gambling came to Pennsylvania in the early 2000s, who had known Billy and the Buffalinos for 30 years, and he had to basically push that association on the side. And when Bill went to prison, that individual claimed that Billy was a informant, which is the worst thing you could do to someone while they're in prison. Now, people in prison that Bill was with knew him and knew his reputation and knew he would never be an informant. And in fact, they were so angry over the allegation, they asked Bill for the contract to kill the billionaire for spreading that rumor. And Bill said no. So he was very well liked in prison. He was very well protected. And he apparently still maintained contact with many of these people in terms of, I guess, phone calls or letters or whatnot after he got out of prison.
You said he didn't have any regrets. But I guess, like you said, if there's loyalty and you break the loyalty and people have to pay, but, we don't know exactly what wasn't put into the book. I'm sure there's some stories that you've heard that probably were like, maybe this shouldn't be put in the book. But he didn't have any regrets for things he may have done that didn't make the book.
No, I think I used, because we talked for so long, you're talking 1.5 years, 2 years, and I had to tell a very clean story.
Yeah.
A compelling story. And I could not use, I used maybe 15, 20% of what he told me.
I was going to say, yeah.
I mean, you can only tell so many stories of him stepping in and negotiating something, no matter who it may be. You know what I mean? You can only tell so many stories of him doing a business deal. So you basically kind of, when you're putting the story together, you're thinking of the beginning, the middle, and the end, of course. And what are the ones that are going to really reflect who he is and how he did business? And of course, are interesting. So there were a number of stories that were really interesting. There were a number of names. In retrospect, maybe I could have put them in there. I'm sure folks would have found it very interesting. But at the end of the day, it's a very, very tight story. And it's very, like I said, very compelling. And it tells his story, I think, very cleanly.
Now, there's also, I act like I know what I'm talking about, but when it comes to the Mafia family or crime family, as they say, of squealers, was he nervous about telling some stories that may be considered squealing on people, or no? Or was
he had to when he got arrested in 2006, he had to testify before a grand jury against that billionaire friend of his that I mentioned to you earlier. Only the government already had the answers to the questions, meaning, did you know, the fellow's name was Louis de Naples, and very powerful, very wealthy individual in Pennsylvania, very well politically connected. And FBI had film on Billy going into De Naples' office. They had film on Billy and De Naples here and there and paperwork and whatnot. So when I asked him a question in the grand jury, did you know Louis De Naples? He's not going to lie and say no, because they already have him on film. So he said yes. So that was the only instance where I think to this day some people might say that he did rat, so to speak, although he never did. Bill's very defensive about that.
Right.
He's very, he lived by this code, this mob code, this mafia code for so many years. It's ingrained in him.
I bet.
Yeah, you could see it. And even when he started telling stories, some stories he would just really get going on because they reminded him of the old times. And, it's just, his memories are just flooding back. And, there were even times where we would conclude an interview for a couple of hours on a given day, and then something would come to mind and he'd just throw it out to me and I go, what? Really? And then I'd have to go sit down because it was that interesting. And we'd sit down for another half hour or so and talk about it. So, but he was a full-blown gangster. And like I said earlier, he had no apologies for it.
Did you ever feel like you're stepping into a potential threat with your career, your life, or anything like that? Because that's still, you're going into an area that can be touchy.
In the beginning.
Oh, okay.
I did, because I had written about Bill. I had written a number of investigative pieces about this gambling situation in Pennsylvania, which was corrupt. It went all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And I wrote a book about Buffalino in 2013. And I thought, my first thought was, I was glad he reached out to me, but then I'm thinking, why is he reaching out to me?
You're like, wait a minute.
Right. So we agreed to meet. The first time we met was at a restaurant. And then we agreed that we would talk. We actually did all the interviews in the old home of Russell Buffalino. It's a ranch-style home in Kingston, Pennsylvania. It's nothing that people would imagine a mob boss would live in. It's actually like a museum. It's as if nothing had been changed since Russell was there. And Bill's son, Russell, now owns the house. It was left to him by Buffalino's wife after she died. And when I sat, we'd sit in the kitchen. Well, after a couple of interviews, we were in the dining room, but then we went to the kitchen, and behind me would be the stairs down to this den where Russell kept all his meetings. And it was kind of dark. And the first couple of times I had gone there, I would consciously turn around just to look at the stairs. So it was just in the back of my head. I mean, now it sounds kind of, I think about it, it sounds kind of, knowing Bill, it sounds kind of foolish. But at the time, I was kind of wondering exactly why he wanted me here and why he wanted to talk. So, but that, after a few months, that went away.
Well, I have to say, I give you kudos, because that's, that is something that I would be like, okay, why does he want to meet? Do I have to bring protection or, but I really appreciate you putting yourself out there, writing this book, and, entertaining people like us that love the true crime genre. And just, even though we say Truth Be Told is a paranormal, but that we're kind of a true crime paranormal type of show. And this is right up our alley. And I know that our audience is going to love it. So, but, well, unfortunately, we got to get out of here. But so tell us, this book, came out, this month, just a couple days ago.
Came out last week.
Yeah.
It went to a second printing in 3 days. And
wow.
Congrats. Up the charts and on several bestseller lists. So I'm pretty pleased so far with the result. Is there going to be a part 2, or is there another crime family you're going after next? I am done. You're like, I'm done. my second mob book. Yeah. And now I think time to move on to something else. Greener pastures, yes. Yeah. Well, where can people find your book and find you? And are you going to be speaking anywhere, like publicly, so people might want to stop in? I'll be in Las Vegas on August 9th at the Mob Museum. And then there's a couple of book signings that are scheduled for later in August. And you'll be able to find them on the website at mattberkbeck.com. Perfect. Well, thank you, Matt, so much for being here and being part of the show. And please, anytime you want to come back, or in your next book, whatever it is, we'd love to have you back, and I appreciate you doing what you do. I appreciate it. Thanks, Tony. All right. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in for Truth Be Told every Friday right here on Truth Be Told channel at 3 p.m. on Fridays. And then make sure Robert Hensley's Monday night show is going to be Minuteman Report, Bonnie Burkett on Wednesdays at 3, and then Espanol Truth Be Told with Metaphor Tuesdays at 3. So until next time, I'm Tony Sweet. Take care of yourselves. This has been another episode of Truth Be Told. Thank you so much for watching. Recorded live at UBN Go Studios in Burbank, California. Join us on social media. Facebook, Truth Be Told Radio. Instagram, Truth Be Told Paranormal. Go to Truth Be Told Worldwide for more information on upcoming shows.